Hi, it's Sam Cook, the founder and the editor of the Ukraine Military History Institute, co-host of the Ukraine Military History podcast. I'd like to introduce the next episode for this podcast, which is a series that I've started and want to continue to do, where me as a military historian, former professor of history or assistant professor of history at West Point, I'd like to continue this series of interviewing historians or military professionals about past military history case studies that I believe are relevant and timely for the Ukrainian military and all militaries to study, to make sense of what's going on the battlefield right now, and how to use history as a tool to transform under fire on the battlefield. And this case study is actually something that my old boss and amazing military historian H.R. McMaster, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, has written several books, award-winning books on military history, including Dereliction of Duty, The Lies That Led to Vietnam, where he talks about the chiefs of staff in the United States Army, the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, and the politics and the mistakes that led to America's defeat in the Vietnam War. And also the author of the book several years ago, which is translated in Ukrainian, Battlegrounds, which talks about the national security environment of the world and his kind of vision of how America and its role should be in that. He gave a speech at the Ukraine Freedom Summit in 2025 in London, where he was talking about his observations as a historian and military theorist and general about the current situation in Ukraine as of fall of 2025, but also what Ukraine and Russia and the war between them shows us about the principles, fundamental, timeless principles of warfare. And one of the things he said in that speech that we should do and Ukraine should do is study a historical case study written by a man named Timothy Lupfer for the Fort Leavenworth Press series on doctrine. And he wrote a paper called The Evolution of German Military Doctrine from 1916 to 1918, which talks about how the German army on the Western Front, under fire, transformed the way it fought from static positional warfare to, first of all, a mobile defense, and then turned the lessons from conducting effective mobile defense on the Western Front into how to transition into offensive operations, which led to the first major breakthroughs at the tactical and even operational level in the spring of 1918. Before the United States was able to get most of its forces over into Europe, the Germans launched a large offensive in the spring of 1918 to try and win the war before American troops entered the battlefield, and they almost succeeded in breaking the French and British lines. And the reason they were almost successful was huge innovation at the lowest level, at the sergeant, junior officer level, which the general officers of the German military, to their credit, General Ludendorff, allowed to happen. Even though these junior officers were very critical of the policies of the general staff of the German army, that same general staff allowed this debate to happen, allowed the lower levels to innovate, spread lessons among each other, debate amongst each other, and really is kind of the template and the idea behind the Ukraine Military History Institute is creating a place where, in writing, Ukrainian officers, Western military officers, historians from both Ukraine and military historians from outside Ukraine can write papers about past history, the current war, debate lessons, and come up with ideas that are going to be helpful in winning the current fight and future fights that Ukraine or its allies may face. And this first case study is something that I actually had already sat down and recorded a discussion on with one of the more respected generals in the Ukrainian Armed Forces, still on active duty, a special advisor to the Minister of Defense, former member of parliament, former commander in 2014 when the war with Russia started in Donetsk and Lugansk, former commander of the Ukrainian Airborne Forces at that time, went on to quit the military and join parliament in 2019, and then when the full-scale invasion happened in 2022, he left parliament, put back on his general officer uniform, served as the deputy commander-in-chief under General Zaluzny, and then when General Syrskyi came in and took over as commander-in-chief, he moved over to become a special advisor, military advisor to the ministers of defense that have served since then. he agreed to do this podcast to help start the conversation about the value of military history, studying military history for Ukrainian officers. So this podcast is going to feature two things. First of all, the clip from a full speech that General H.R. McMaster gave at the London Ukraine Freedom Summit last year in 2025 about the importance of studying military history, and specifically this historical case study. And then General Zabrodskyi and I will go into our recorded conversation where we talk about this. Now, for those of you who are watching this and would like to get access to the English article, the PDF that we're discussing, and the Ukrainian translation of the article, there's actually two articles, Lupfer's article, and then another article I wrote connecting the German innovations in World War I to their breakthrough in 1940 at Sedan against the French in 1940. Those two articles, both translated, are going to be inside the membership site, and those of you who want to donate to and get access to these and discuss these articles outside of the public view, you can donate to that. If you're a Ukrainian service member or a veteran, you can get access to this for free by registering based on your active or veteran status. For everyone else who's not Ukrainian on those two statuses, we expect some kind of donation for you to get access to this. You can donate one time or actually donate to become a member and get access to this and all future publications for the Ukrainian Military History Institute. So with that, please enjoy this episode of the Ukrainian Military History Institute, my conversation on the evolution of German military doctrine from 1916 to 18 with Lieutenant General Mykhailo Zabrodskyi. Before we start this episode, I just wanted to make a quick word to mention our sponsors. I'm going to give you a brief introduction for our sponsors, and then at the end of the show, we'll do a longer discussion about each sponsor and what we're offering so that you can get right into the content. So this podcast is funded by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation is a foundation that I established to make sure Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And we have two main centers that are, in effect, the sponsor for this podcast. The first center is the Ukraine Military History Institute. It's an English-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking center, which is, our mission is to translate Ukraine's history from Ukrainian into English for the world to consume and learn from. Ukraine has a lot of allies who've supported it. Almost all of them, the common language of military officers, military historians, and professionals is English. So the Ukraine Military History Institute created and sponsors this. And I'll tell you all about our programs and how you can support the Institute at the end of the episode. The second sponsor for this podcast is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is also part of the Borderlands Foundation. It's a center dedicated to research and raising awareness and helping to bring in to Ukraine cutting edge therapies, treatments, protocols, and education related to post-traumatic stress disorder. The heroes of Ukraine that are fighting this war, whether they're Ukrainians or foreigners who've come in to fight side by side with Ukrainians, they're writing this history, which creates the stories, which creates a strong future country. And those memories have costs, so we're dedicated to helping advance the research, treatment, and breakthrough that all soldiers, veterans can have dealing with and overcoming post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health that arises from their service. And then finally, our last sponsor is the Borderlands Group. This is a for-profit company that donates the money to fund the Borderlands Foundation and all of our programs. I'm also the founder and president of that organization. And we do military advisory for defense companies working inside Ukraine, and consulting and software development and technical work for both governments and military defense companies. So with that, that's our sponsors. At the end of the podcast, I'm going to tell you a lot more about each sponsor if you're looking for ways that you can contribute to the Borderlands Foundation, our two centers, or if you'd like to work with myself, Rob, and other contributors for this podcast. I'll talk to you about how you can get in touch with us through the Borderlands Group for that.
I look at what's happened in Ukraine. Oftentimes I think it really mirrors to some extent the Western Front in World War I. When you had a situation where, with the advent of the machine gun initially, and then the massive artillery, that the offensive was no longer viable. What happened under those conditions, what the Germans called in the 1916 period, Materialschlacht, with like massive artillery, is their solution was the elastic defense, because troops who were forward, much like today, who are forward are vulnerable to FPV drones and other capabilities. They had to create greater depth in the battlefield, thin out the front lines with just machine gun outposts and so forth. And then to restore mobility on the battlefield in the 1917 into 1918 period, especially during the Ludendorff offensives, the idea was to use infiltration tactics or Hoodier tactics. Very small teams that could infiltrate, get behind the front lines, attack in depth. And this is, I think, what we've seen Russia try to do with these offensives and so forth. So I see a lot of analogies, between these adaptations in World War I. But of course, it wasn't until like the advent of mobile protected firepower in the tank that mobility was really restored to the battlefield. And we saw that obviously with the attacks in 1940, for example. So the technologies will be much different to restore mobility to the battlefield, but I think at the operational level, we need a whole range of capabilities to do that. And of course, as I mentioned, with these observations at the strategic level, we have seen the battlefield in depth become very transparent because of drone capabilities, because of low Earth orbit and capabilities, but also the whole range of big data analytical and AI-related capabilities to make sense of all that data and create a high degree of transparency. So at the operational level, to restore mobility, I think the second key observation is we have to develop a whole range of capabilities to blind our enemies and deceive our enemies.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast, and I'm sitting here with a very special guest. I'm excited to speak to General Mykhailo Zabrodskyi, or he has asked me to call him Michael, English version of his name, who General Zabrodskyi studied in the United States in Command and General Staff College. Which year did you study there?
26, 27.
2006 to 2007, when General Petraeus was actually there as the commander of Fort Leavenworth, rewriting U.S. Army doctrine in the middle of the Iraq War. And the lesson that the podcast that we're putting out today is an experiment. We have this idea that how can a history center for Ukraine be useful during a full-scale war? Well, most people are too busy or don't want to speak freely about their current experiences that they've had during this war. But actually, so I was thinking about waiting to launch this podcast until after the war when more people were able to speak, but got a strange request, or an interesting request, from a Ukrainian Army brigade asking if they could help them study military history. And they'd done a bunch of research, and they said, hey, we think that this is a great way for our staff to think creatively about the challenges we're facing on the battlefield against Russia. And they said, we've studied all the military history programs out there, and we think West Point is the best. Well, I happen to be an assistant professor of history at West Point and studied there in the history department, where they famously said much of the history we teach was made by the people that we taught, right? So I offered to put this lesson together, to put it out there to this brigade or any brigade out there that would like to study military history, to help them think through the problems, the challenges they're facing on the battlefield. And I designed a lesson for this brigade or any brigade in the Ukrainian Armed Forces that might find it useful, based on a very influential paper that I read, and actually I think you read back in Command and General Staff College 20 years ago when you were there. And it's called The Evolution of German Military Doctrine from 1916 to 1917, 1918, Fort Leavenworth Papers. And the reason I picked this lesson for this unit was, and we're going to talk about this in detail, is this paper, which was written for the Command and General Staff College by their press, is a great historical parallel to the situation I think Ukraine currently finds itself in. Third year of a very long, bloody, protracted war, lots of technological innovation, a smaller army, just like the German army was much smaller manpower compared to its combined sum of its enemies on the battlefield, and a very difficult situation, demanding new thinking, and how they had some success that could have become major for them on the battlefield if it weren't for some larger political, economic factors that were going against them. The reason I asked General Zabrodskyi on here was I do not want to be sitting here telling the Ukrainian army in the abstract how to translate this case study to their military. I found General Zabrodskyi because I read some articles about him and his background as a Command and General Staff College graduate in the United States, and someone who is an avid historian. Read, I think, someone I can talk to on a level of, he's read a lot of things I haven't read, and I think vice versa. I've read a few things that I'm going to share with him. But I found my Ukrainian counterpart in the military history profession, the world, that I think would be a great conversation. And the vision of this center is to bring the Western military tradition and the study of military art and history into Ukraine, and combine that with your own rich history of military art, right? Ukraine is innovated throughout history. That's why it's here as a country, because of great warfighters against all odds. I think Ukraine exists in the last 100 years as a country because of a strong military tradition that has grown up here out of the heritage that it got from Russian Empire, Soviet Union, its own Cossack and older military traditions. So this is a great opportunity, I think, to have a conversation, start a conversation, and merge perspectives from both sides. So, General Zabrodskyi, just a little bit before we go into this, you served, and actually you're still a active serving Lieutenant General in the Ukrainian military, former commander of the airborne forces, and just a couple minutes about your background.
Yes, I'm still in active duty. I started to serve in Ukrainian Army Forces in 2001. And I go through the position of platoon leader to the Air Assault Forces commander. After that, I spent some portion of my life as a member of Parliament of Ukraine. And as soon as the large-scale invasion started, I joined the army and served as the deputy of Commander-in-Chief of Army Forces of Ukraine. And now I'm working for Ministry of Defense.
Okay. So you've got a lot of experience all the way from the tactical level on the battlefield in the early years of the war, all the way up to building the airborne forces from, I think you were the first commander of Ukraine's airborne forces. Like you stood up that part of the forces?
Historically true. We should say I was not the first,
Yeah.
definitely. Enough people was before me, but probably I will the first one who was a commander of Air Assault Forces in their new vision and new modification.
Yeah.
And for sure, it was a time when the Air Assault Forces, firstly in their biography, start to take the actions in the real war.
Yeah. Just talk me through a little bit for the American audience. How did you get to study at Command General, the Command and General Staff College in the United States? And what was that experience like for you as someone who grew up? I mean, I think you were educated. You actually went to military academy in St. Petersburg, and then you went through the Ukrainian military system. Talk about how you got selected to go teach at or study at Command and General Staff College, and what that experience was like for you.
Probably I should say it was accidentally, but it was not accidentally. I was a really lucky man. It was already many years ago. We had a special selection procedure, and somehow, even I don't know how, even now, I was like a #1 candidate.
Did you actively apply, or did they just say, hey, we're going to put you in this process?
No, the special people, the special department at that time in the Land Forces Command, they make like a selection, of the people, and I was a young enough major at that time. And absolutely unexpectedly for me, I got the invitation, okay, would you like? I say yes, but I had no idea what I say in that time. And after that, they direct us to the special language course in Lockland Air Force Base in Texas.
Yeah.
And after that, like a follow-on course, it was the CJC.
Yeah. And when you were an officer before that, how extensive was your study of military history? Were you all already interested in military history as an academic professional study project, or was this something that you picked up at the Fort Leavenworth?
I do not remember exactly the duration, of course. And by the way, we had a few historical courses.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, and probably the most significant one, is the United States Civil War. Other one, like a general military history,
Mm-hmm.
and a special historical course about the Pacific War
Yeah.
during the World War II, and the special historical course about the war in Europe
Yeah.
in frame of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest expression was, I was very surprised because it was definitely not like a Soviet or post-Soviet military school. That any historical event, any actions, any decision, we try to consider as a part of a big military decision-making process. And immediately, as we get any information or read any article or read any book about some events, some actions, we establish a direct connection to the current situation. And that time it was the time of Iraq War. Actually, the war itself already finished, but the operation in Iraq was in progress at that time. And any historical fact, any historical person, any historical situation, we try to immediately project it on the current environment.
Did you find that helpful?
I find it unusual, first of all, and for sure, I find it helpful, but not at that time. It came later.
Yeah. So the paper we're going to go, actually there's two papers that I've laid out in this lesson, and what I'm trying to do here is if a military history brigade wants to, or if a military brigade in active duty wants to study military history, first of all, please do reach out if you'd like to speak to myself and or General Zabrodskyi and say, here's how to learn with military history. But the format we used at West Point, and I'm going to go through here, is before every lesson, every student was expected to read quite a bit. And I think you had this at Command and General Staff College, the same thing. You're expected to show up and having read the lesson. So we've translated these two articles we're talking about here into Ukrainian. And we've got the original English sources. And General Zabrodskyi is very kind to help me with the translation because there's very specialized military historical translation that was needed. And I'm going to start actually with the end, and then we're going to work our way back to the beginning of a 25-year doctrinal revolution that emerged in the German army. So in 2004, when I was I was studying probably right before you went to Command and General Staff College as a young captain, I was observing the Iraq War as someone who was about to deploy there. The high intensity combat operations had just finished. It had gone well. It was a 3.5 week operation. The regime fell. But what was not going well was the post-war period where we were trying to secure the country, and that's where a lot of Ukrainian soldiers ended up deploying as part of the Iraq stability force there afterwards. And when I was in Army Captain's Career Course at Fort Knox, I was trying to give critiques of the course that, hey, we need to update the way we're teaching our doctrine, because our doctrine, we're still fighting the Soviet army from 1980s, and we haven't updated our course at all to think about the modern operating context. And this article was an article I wrote, which ended up being an article for that class. It was a paper, and it got turned into a Armor magazine article, which did pretty well. It was a cover magazine article, and this is a professional journal where officers wrote to other officers and started debates among each other. And it was about the German invasion of France in 1940. And before World War II, we like to look back on World War II and we see that, okay, well, France fell in 6 weeks, but that was not the expected outcome. France had, I think, almost twice as many tanks as the German army. They had, by many respects, the British and the French had more modern air force. The Germans were actually outnumbered by a factor of about 2 to 1 on the Western Front before the invasion of France. And France falling in 6 weeks, with everyone's memory of World War I, when France became a bloody stalemate, that was not the expected outcome. But it's what happened. It really changed the trajectory in the course of World War II to the point where Nazi Germany had some small chance of winning the war based on their victories in the West, but it wasn't the expected outcome. And I just wrote an article, and I wanted to discuss that article with you, General Zabrodskyi, because the article is the outcome of something that started 25 years before, which we're going to go into a lot more detail, which is the Fort Leavenworth papers on the evolution of German doctrine. But it was about how did this lightning campaign of 6 weeks happen? How did the French army collapse? British army got chased off of the continent. And I talked about in the article the main lessons from that. So the reason I put this article out in tandem with the German evolutionary doctrine from World War I is these two things are very connected. And the German army after World War I lost. I mean, ultimately the country lost. The army didn't feel like they'd lost on the battlefield, but the German army, was kicked out of France at the end of the war. They were disarmed. They went down to 100,000 soldiers. And then they come back after the interwar period and shock the world on the battlefields of World War II. And why that happened was the Germans really studied and internalized and understood the lessons from World War I that they learned, and then successfully integrated new technology into a new system of training and doctrine. So any foreign military who's watching the war in Ukraine and says, okay, well, we're just going to order a bunch of Ukrainian drones and give them to our units and we're ready to fight on the modern battlefield, that's not going to be successful. The United States Army is behind right now in drone warfare. I think all of my old colleagues from the Army who are now brigade commanders understand we have a lot to learn from what the Ukrainians are doing on the battlefield. We need to figure out how to face the threat of drones and integrate drones into our operations at a much smaller level. So this article was the outcome, or is a summary of the outcome of 25 years of change, which we're going to go into in detail in the Fort Leavenworth paper. So why don't you share with me your impressions of the 1940 campaign in that paper, so we can discuss that and then get into the German doctrine of World War
I. I should start from a right assessment of force ratio. You repeat this point in your article a few times. France, Belgium, and some other countries of so-called Benelux. Totally, they had like 3 times or 4 times more tanks such as Germany at that time.
With the British Army, the French, and all those.
And partly the 2 British Corps.
Yeah.
Yes. But the question is not a total number of tanks.
Yeah.
The question is a number of tanks in right place and right time.
Yeah.
And the military art itself, it starts from the ability to create such conditions when in right time, in right place, you have the overwhelming number of tanks, for instance. And German, they will quite succeed in this.
Yeah.
they really demonstrate it is possible. After the awful conditions of World War One, when everybody adjusts to the long fronts, position, war, trench cases, small assault, small advance, back and forth. Yes, they really demonstrate for all Europe and for all world the new style of warfare, the new style of maneuver, mechanized warfare. And even more, they demonstrate that you are able to concentrate all your efforts and all your forces on the right direction and conduct the concentration strike. Actually, what they did with the during the first part of French campaign, so-called the Yellow Plan. Yellow Plan. As for Blitzkrieg itself, I strongly believe that Blitzkrieg it was not a process. It was a product. It was a result of 25 years of development of doctrine, of training of troops, of discussion, of comparison of different points of view with a proper industrial basis. I mean mechanized, really mechanized, with avoiding of international sanctions. By the way, yes. The first direct connection to the...
And thanks to a lot of help from the Soviet Union, specifically training in Ukraine.
Yes, and by the way, not only Soviet Union. Not only Soviet Union. But anyway, yes, everything this happens. And we should take a look on the Blitzkrieg, real like a finish, not only like a start point.
Actually, Blitzkrieg was never something the German military called it. That was a propaganda term that Goebbels, it was
Yes,
but
anyway, it's comfortable enough for understanding and we continue to use it. And some indirect improvement of this point is that after the 1939 and 1940, actually, with exception of 1941 in USSR, the fascist Germany never repeated. Never repeated. And this is the next point which we need to pay attention. A very easy question, why? Everybody adjust? No. The right style and new improvements, they work with some limited period of time. As long as you keep some fresh vision. As long as your enemy or your potential enemy cannot create something against these tactics, this doctrine. As for me, it's a really interesting point for study and for research, how the USSR in that time, how the American army in that time already, British army, and other countries who fight on the fronts of World War II, how they did it. How? Not how the Blitzkrieg is appear, but how the Blitzkrieg was stopped.
How armies adapt. And one of the things I think this paper illustrates is that wars start in very unpredictable ways. When Russia invaded Ukraine, most of the world predicted a certain outcome, which didn't happen. It was a very unlikely outcome from the analyst historical perspective. Just like this, I mean, the world is ultimately, the intelligence community, all military analysts I know were shocked that Russia did not win quickly in Ukraine, right? And that's, I think, a historical turning point, because if Russia would have succeeded, not in 3 days, but like, let's say, a couple months, and Ukraine comes under the control of Russia, then all of Europe's at threat. They control this massive population resource base, and world history looks very differently. And in this war, 6 weeks is not enough time for an army to adjust, right? So when France failed to defend a concentrated assault, integrating all this new technology in one portion of the front, the entire front collapsed. And in the Soviet Union, because there's a lot more space, the same approach just didn't work. Strategically, the Germans did not have enough manpower. The Soviet Union was able to mobilize a lot of manpower and industry in a very short period of time. and they weren't able to repeat that success on the Eastern Front. And then armies started to innovate and share with each other, and yeah, the Germans lost their ability to win quick, decisive victories.
You know, the military prediction and the national expectation from any war conflict, it's always a very controversial thing.
Yeah.
I want to introduce the other example, the Poland.
Yeah. 1939.
Yes, 1939, the country, the army, the Polish army, was fully mobilized, almost fully. They did not accomplish the mobilization plan, but anyway, they was ready for war, as they guess, in that time. They were ready to fight, they were ready to defend their country. And he had pretty enough the combat spirit, and willing to fight.
And they fought hard, and they inflicted a lot of casualties.
Yeah, they knew enemy.
Yeah.
They had almost one-to-one force Russia with the fascist German army, with the Wehrmacht at that time.
Yeah.
But 2 weeks.
Well, part of that was when the Soviet Union came in on the other side. That
But
didn't help.
But it was not decisive.
Yeah.
It was not. It was a painful. It's like a
It made
strike
it quicker.
on your back. But anyway, it was not decisive.
Yeah.
And everybody recognizes it now.
Yeah.
And the other situation, the Soviet Union. Now, you know, the people, when we try to find the easy explanation of complicated things. Oh, Germans was not precise in their calculations how many tanks and people they need to go to Volga or something like that. But let's go and let me make one step back. Everybody hear about the Barbarossa plan.
Yeah.
But in fact, Barbarossa plan was accomplished.
Yeah.
Nobody want to recognize it even now, especially in Russia, because for there the World War II, or as they say, Great Patriotic War, it's only victories, victories, and victories, success, success, and success. But in fact, the Barbarossa plan was accomplished. And the question is, who was wrong? German general staff? No. Maybe something else. Maybe some other factors. Maybe. But let's go back to Blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
In that time, and even now, if we are past 80 years, we are talking about the Blitzkrieg. The impression of this really flash war, fast war, so high that past next 50 or 60 years, any war, looks like an attempt to repeat the Blitzkrieg.
American Army tried it twice.
American Army tries at least twice officially, but unofficially much more.
Yeah. Well, we were successful twice in Iraq, first and second time with the fast war, but not in Korea and Vietnam.
Even Russia.
Yeah.
Even Russia.
Yeah.
Invasion in Georgia, 28.
Yeah.
It's a small model of Blitzkrieg.
And what they thought would happen in Kiev.
A large-scale invasion to Ukraine in the spring
model.
2022.
Yeah.
It's a next attempt, just repeat the Blitzkrieg on new technological level.
Country collapses and... Yeah.
Yes. It's, I touch these examples in order to demonstrate that nevertheless, and more than 80 years already gone,
yeah,
it still touch the imagination, it still touch the military ideas, it still touch the military doctrine, and everybody wants to be at least such successful as the Wehrmacht did in 1940.
Yeah, Soviets actually did it in Hungary, they did it in Prague, they did it in Afghanistan. And a lot of people actually look back at Afghanistan and say that was actually the same model they wanted to apply. Or Putin was watching, you know, American soldiers raise a flag in Baghdad after 3.5 weeks saying, well, we could easily do that. I mean...
By the way, if it touches the Soviets, again, I know at least one historical example when the Soviet Blitzkrieg was successful.
Yeah.
It's in 1945, Manchuria.
Yeah.
Like 2 weeks.
It was actually, a lot of historians argue that was a decisive factor in getting Japan out of the war, much more so than the...
Somebody guess it's something which the Soviet Union going to do in 1941. But the fascist Germany just make a strike fast.
Yeah. Yeah, and in 1940, and we talk about kind of the myth and reality of it. First of all, the Germans had, in a lot of ways, definitely quantitatively less armor, and a lot of the tanks were older. They were tanks that they'd captured in Czechoslovakia. They had very small, these were the Mark III, Mark IV tanks compared to much bigger British and American tanks. But what the Germans had done is they'd put radios on every single tank, and they'd enabled communication. Rather than making tanks mobile pillboxes supporting the infantry, they created their own organization around new technology and concentrated the small amount of armor that they had in one area of the front line. Let's talk a little bit about mission command and pushing down initiative to the lowest level. You've been in the Ukrainian military for a long time. There's Soviet command and control tradition. Then you have the German tradition, which is, they call it Auftragstaktik, which is mission tactics. American Army has adopted that as its own, style of, and you've learned that at Command and General Staff College. How important do you think that was in this case study, and how important do you think that is right now?
I cannot be agree with you that it was a real German officer corps tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was not.
Mm-hmm.
You write a lot and absolutely right things about the push and pass the initiative and responsibility down for a few levels of command, but I cannot imagine any initiative in the army of, for instance, Friedrich the Great.
Yeah. No, this was a
100 years before World War I.
No, this was a new innovation in the German military. It wasn't a long tradition.
If we consider the innovation something like a thing which was born because of declaration or because of order,
Mm-hmm.
yes. But I believe it was not an innovation, it was just a situational response
Mm-hmm.
of what happens.
Yeah.
And it was an absolutely logical response of the situation with manpower in the army. Remember, like Ludendorff described the officer corps and the middle and junior commanders level.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of officers from the reserve.
Yeah.
It was a lot of young officers. It was a lot of officers which were sergeants a couple months before.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the same situation as Ukrainian army forces now.
Yeah.
And the people, they bring on this level of command their own understanding what they should do or what they should not do.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the frame of their independence in decision, in actions, and in responsibility. I don't want to say it happens just because it happens.
Yeah.
But I guess it happens without any additional exterior projection from the high command.
Most innovations never come from the high command.
Yes, but one of the vital, important condition of living this innovation, it's a support from higher command.
Yeah, recognizing what was culturally coming up and institutionalizing it. Okay, so one of the big lessons from 1940 was the German officer corps did well because they had a culture of younger commanders not asking for detailed instructions and or creating their own plans that were deviations from their instructions to accomplish the mission. There was a classic example in the article of they had three divisions on a route of march going towards Sedan, and one of the corps was held up, and the commander decided without informing higher command to go out of his sector, seize a bridge, because the mission was to, facilitate the follow-on forces, and he viewed deviating from his sector as an acceptable disobedience, as it were.
Deviation or broke the core boundaries.
Yeah.
Which is example, but maybe not the best one.
Yeah.
I mean, from time to time, such cases, it happens during the war, during any operation.
Yeah.
I believe we can find, if if we will wish, we can find such examples even in Iraq war.
Sure, of course.
It's absolutely normal.
Mm-hmm.
The question is no how and why it happens. The question is how the high command assess it,
Yeah.
and how the high command adopt it. Okay, you cross the boundary, not a problem.
Yeah.
It was reasonable, yes, go ahead. And this again, we need to go back to the different understanding of military culture.
Mm-hmm.
For somebody, not for somebody, for most part of the armies in the world, it's absolutely normal.
Yeah.
Now it's hard to say who was the initial source of such approach. Maybe Brits, maybe Americans as a young country, maybe France with a democracy and broad vision of any process, including the warfare. But anyway, it's absolutely normal for most European armies now. And it's very hard to maintain it and spread it in a Soviet army and post-Soviet army, as Ukrainian army forces now looks like.
Yeah.
It's very hard. And I believe the question is not a limitation of people's imagination, not a limitations of experience or understanding of situation. The question is on the level of responsibility. When you let people make a decision on their own level, they can be unbelievably effective. It's absolutely, yes. And surprise you and surprise everybody and surprise themselves, first of all. But the question is, if something happens wrong.
What happens?
For instance, you are not accomplish the mission. You get a losses.
Yeah.
Or you get a losses and you are not accomplish the mission. Worst case scenario. The question is when the prosecutor come, he will ask you, okay,
what were your orders?
Where's the orders? Show me the orders.
Yeah.
And number one question, how? Why?
Yeah.
And after that, very logical result.
There was my old commander, General McMaster, he used to say, you'll never get punished for doing nothing, but you'll certainly get punished for doing, he would rail against this sins of omission, which is not doing anything. That's okay because you're not violating anything, but you try to do something with initiative and you're getting punished for that. And if people can see that what your intention was and you failed, but you had the right intention within the commander's intent, that's part of war and unfortunately part of the fight. And you're right, it completely is a cultural thing. What would you rather see? People waiting around to be told what to do, and those orders always come late and they're incomplete because higher never knows the situation on the ground as well as that commander? Or do you encourage with, when something goes wrong, looking at, okay, what can we learn from this? What was trying to be done, but not prosecute someone for a mistake, literally prosecute. That sends a chill through. No one's ever going to do anything if they're worried about going to jail because, well, if I do nothing, I'm definitely not going to go to jail. We might lose the battle, but I'm not going to go to jail.
It's why so many armies in the world try to be as United States Army is.
Yeah, but it's difficult because there's got to be a culture of protecting that kind of decision making as a priority. It's something that this is a cultural priority for this army, which is we protect people who step up and try to make decisions without being told what to do based on the commander's intent.
I know clear that it is a product of decades and centuries. It is not something you can just push by directive or order.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it by this way.
Yeah.
No, you need to create it. You need to let it grow up. You need people to understand deeply in their brain, their heart, why they should do in this way.
So, General, the discussion of Sedan and World War II and this popular historical branded term of Blitzkrieg was really a prelude to the main lesson here, which is such spectacular successes. I'm an overnight success, 10 years in the making, people like to say in business, when someone all of a sudden becomes really famous or successful, people almost always look past or ignore all the preparation it took to get there. And this German spectacular success, which has captured the imagination of every country that's gone to war since, from American to Russian military, was 25 years, really 25 years in the making. And the case study that we've translated into Ukrainian, thanks to your great help, translation, was the evolution of German military doctrine from 1916 to 1918. It was a classic case study written by Fort Leavenworth Press, something that you actually had a copy of it when I sent to you. You had a copy of it on your desk, so you'd obviously read it in the past. And we chose this because it's a very practical way to use history to find something that's very similar to what Ukrainian military is going through right now. History is never an exact repetition of the past, but there can be scenarios where 60-70% of what you're going through is very similar, and I think that's the case here. So let's talk about the evolution of German military doctrine. In 1916, the German army was really bleeding out from repeated kind of almost what a lot of people in the West viewed as meat assaults. The Battle of the Somme, the French assaults were very costly for the Allies. But on the other side, the German military was really struggling in the face of these assaults. They were almost breaking at certain points. From their perspective, the Somme was a huge blow, even though the British lost a lot more. The Germans took a lot of casualties there. And they realized there has to be a better way to do this defensive elastic, or what became known as elastic defense. There has to be a better way than positional defense. And they came up with, through this paper describes in detail the process, they came up with a new way of defending. So describe for me what your impressions of what the German military did, and more importantly, how this might be relevant to the Ukrainian military on changing the way they think about defense.
Despite of long enough historical period, I mean from 1916 to 1940, I believe we need to separate these two periods, because they provide for us two different kinds of evolution. The situation 1916, it is a wartime situation.
Yeah.
It's a search of specific decision which can break the stalemate, operational stalemate during the war time. And some certain portion of very unique and very particular conditions in that time. And the situation past 1918 up to the 40, it's other kind of situation. It's a situation when the country, in fact, lost the war, and the country and society, German society, was very frustrated because it was impossible. The biggest, probably the strongest army in the Europe, if not involved, was not defeated on the battlefield, but the country itself was defeated.
Yeah.
And the people tried to find again, easy explanation of complicated thing. But the military tried to find pure military reason why it happens. But one element, he is unite both of these evolutions. The German precisely assess the initial conditions. I guess the biggest reason of fault of any innovation is incorrect assessment of initial situation. In 1916, Germans understand situation quite well. Okay, almost stabilized line of contact. The serials of unsuccessful local battles, assaults, very bloody. The shortage of manpower, the shortage of ammo,
Which Germany had a much bigger problem with manpower and ammo.
Yes, which is makes the situation quite close to the Ukrainian situation now.
Yeah.
And they understand clearly that they need to find any solution, and they will have only one turn to find the solution. Just because of additional to lack of manpower and lack of ammo, it is a lack of time.
Yeah. Because the economy was going against them.
Because economy go down, because of economical blockade, and so on and so on.
Which I think is the difference between Russia and Ukraine right now is Ukraine, even though it has a shortage in manpower and ammunition compared to Russia and North Korea and Iran and all the power supporting it, they may have a more stable economic situation, which is one key difference, but the same disadvantages.
Yes, but maybe the generation of discussion about the current situation in Ukraine, it's outside of frame of our topic.
Yeah.
But we need to underline the key of success of development of any innovation. It's a absolute understanding, clear understanding of situation where you know.
And how did they get that?
Yes. And only after that, what you need to do to make something better.
So why do you think they, first of all, a lot of armies fail to assess the problem and even define the problem, as you say. Why do you think the Germans were successful assessing their current situation?
The reason can be different, or actually the understanding of reason can be different. Probably this is a German nature, to be very careful, very strict. It's like a part of national character. And maybe because of the high level of military culture, when the subordinate send on the top level of command the information, not what they want to hear, but what is real.
Yeah.
Yeah, so by the way, it is a problem. It is a problem, and such disease has any army in the world, at least from time to time. And Germans somehow avoid it. And common effort, they create the real understanding of the real situation on the high command. I think it is one of the main factor why the main command maintain the innovation and try to find the source, the initial source of such innovation, even from the lowest level, even from insights of junior officers, junior leaders, or maybe not only officers, by the way.
Sergeants, yeah, actually.
And the sergeants as well. And they did not keep any additional arrogance, or we are generals, we are no better.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can laugh, but again, from time to time, it happens in any army in the world, in any war.
I saw it in the American army for sure.
I can say the same about Ukrainian army.
Yeah.
So, the methodology of creation of innovation, what is the real example for follow on? What is the real example how to do it? Actually, is a right. It is a almost complete manual how to do it. Again, not what to do, because of 100 years gap.
Yeah.
Because the situation now is different.
Yeah, it's different.
But we already told the situation is the same. But real methodology, real the way how to do it. Maybe not what to do, but as a how to do the German innovations during the interwar period and during the World War I, sorry, could be a perfect example. A perfect example how the state and the army and the full scale of army forces need to create, maintain, develop, and employ the innovations.
And I think this is very important for Ukraine right now as we're recording. It's early or May of 2025. There's talk of some kind of cessation of hostilities, ceasefire, potentially leading to maybe just an armistice or peace, which means we're going into an interwar period, as I like to say. Every war in history follows a war before it. And how do we learn during the war now, as long as it lasts, whether it's a month or a year or 5 years, and then how do you innovate afterwards? So the German army, you said, correctly assessed the problem because they solicited feedback from the lowest levels of command, encouraged, and this, actually this is important, this came from 1916, something important happened. General Ludendorff, who'd been very successful on the Eastern Front, where there was much more maneuver happening, and had actually faced off against some very legendary Russian Empire generals, Brusilov, who actually was the most famous general of the war. The Allies, there were like songs and all kinds of movies made about him because of his successes on the Eastern Front. They learned fighting a different style that wasn't as positional in the East. He came to the Western Front as a new commander of the Western Front, and encouraged, or his staff, and he encouraged and didn't shoot down ideas just because it was a sergeant or a captain submitted.
I'm not going to criticize General Brusilov
Yeah.
actions during the World War One, but yes, I agree. Probably is one of the most remarkable examples of operational art and unusual approach how to conduct the offensive on the broad front.
Mm-hmm.
But the historical fact is the Brusilov's breakthrough was a real tactical success.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a
Operational.
success and not an operational scale success.
Yeah.
For some different reasons. Maybe not because of Brusilov,
Yeah.
because of other elements
Logistics.
of situation. Yes, but it is a fact. It is a fact. And I think we had some kind of analogy. It's like Germans' attempts to conduct the offensive before adopting the new doctrine
Mm-hmm.
in 1916.
Yeah.
It's like a French attempt to conduct the offensive as their commander-in-chief did for some small tactical case,
Yeah.
and try to project it, mechanical projection for full scale. Okay, let's do this way,
And it
we will get a success.
led to almost collapse in the French army.
Yes.
They had a mutiny.
And again, back to
1917.
Brusilov. Never before Brusilov and never after Brusilov, Russian Empire Army conduct something the same.
Yeah. Yeah. But the Germans learned from that, and Ludendorff, as a new commander, came in and said, let's start figuring this out on the Western Front, because it had been static, it had been bloody positional warfare, and he wanted to change the dynamic. And there was this real energy, and actually this is something I remember. I was in Iraq in 2005 and 6 as a junior commander. It wasn't going well. I was in a good unit. Colonel McMaster was very innovative, but I saw him fighting against forces of an army that wasn't yet reforming the way we fought. And then when General Petraeus came in, and I went to serve under him as a commander of the second tour, the whole culture of the army felt different. It's like, hey, we're a learning organization. Everything's changing. The commander is constantly traveling around, talking to soldiers, going on patrol, and learning. And this is something I have an interview with General Petraeus we'll release on this podcast, which I think can be the subject of some very good future military history discussions that will help the Ukrainian military, is we were a learning army. And that culture started at the top. No, the culture was there, but the top allowed the culture to grow. Versus before, the culture was there, but there's just a lot of frustration, and there was no systemization of that learning and cross-pollination. And so Ludendorff allows these papers to be written. They circulate these papers among the junior officers. And the German army found that, and this is a very common thing when you've conquered some territory, or even worse, like the French army, you're defending your own land. There's a very strong aversion from political to strategic high command all the way down to ever give up any ground, because that's giving up ground that either we paid for in blood to conquer, or it's our land, right, as the French were defending. And the Germans created this very different approach. They went from positional defense to elastic defense. And this actually, we see traces of that even to this day. We saw that with the Russian defensive plan in 2023 against a counteroffensive was this much more defense in depth, which the Germans were the first ones to really institutionalize this on the Western Front, was this elastic defense. And it was an outpost zone where they'd create outposts, and they'd have some forward trench lines there. Then you'd have the main defensive zone, and then you'd have the rearward zone, which is where reserves were gathered and ready to counterattack. And when the Germans were attacked in 1917, they were able to repel these attacks because 1917 was supposed to be the year the Allies were going to break through, but they weren't able to because the Germans, with a lot less casualties and much more effectiveness, were able to repel these attacks given the constraints of manpower, ammunition. So talk about your impressions of that doctrine and the shift and what effect that had on the German military.
I should start from the role of a person in such situation. I mean the person from the high echelon of military leadership. And the creation of such atmosphere, as you write, for discussion, for open discussion, for different questions, objections, whatever, it's art. It's art of how to manage the people. And this is not just a civilian business. This is the army, and this is a wartime. I believe the decision to let this discussion go and to discuss openly a new tactical approach is probably the most effective decision during all the war for Ludendorff. It is important. You know, the French people, they try to do something like that, but only something. And only Germans, with their attention to any details, really apply it in a large scale. And the result was absolutely logical. The result was, okay, they create a new offensive doctrine.
We're defensive first.
First defensive, but
Then
remember
offensive.
the offensive doctrine was created on the base of offensive doctrine. And I want to say even more. If we go deeper and take a look on the World War II, the principles of elastic defense, but in that time it had another name already. All armies during the World War II continue to apply it.
Yeah.
Even more in post-World War II period, a long time.
Right in the heart of Europe.
Yes, in the Soviet doctrine as well, the United States Army doctrine.
Yeah.
The base is elastic defense.
Yes.
And
The whole plan to
the
defend
same
Germany.
principle, trade the territory,
Yeah.
let the enemy go inside, and after that, the strike,
Counterattack.
counterattack. The same principle. Something maybe was developed more and can do better. Something can do on the other level of technological, the other technological level. But the principle there, this is the key principle. In this sense, the German innovation still alive even today.
Yeah.
Back to the role. As for me, it's quite important for high leadership not to create the new doctrine by themselves.
No.
First of all, it's impossible, because when the people go through the different positions because of their duty, they just do not have a time and ability to catch everything. Sure, most of them continue to keep the imagination how it's going on battlefield from their time. Sure, from time to time they can chance to observe how it's going now. But anyway, it's not a job and not a duty of high-level leadership to create a doctrine. And a German example, in this case, it is a perfect example. Remember, the doctrine was written by lieutenant colonel and a captain.
Yeah.
Smart guys in staff. Such guys, any staff has such guys.
Yes.
Very quiet people, they just do their work. But they collect, generalize, systemize, and produce the idea.
When General Petraeus, while you were at Fort Leavenworth, wrote the counterinsurgency manual, he wasn't writing it. He collected the smartest guys in the U.S. Army. From my old commander, Colonel McMaster, contributed a lot, and a lot of other people were bringing in those ideas, and they did it very quickly because he put command focus and attention on the culture and the staff that would do it.
But remember, we are talking about the situation 1 year ahead.
Yeah.
With experience of 2 world wars already.
Yeah.
And the Ludendorff situation was different. It was a classical approach.
Yeah.
The high leadership always right. I know better because I'm general and blah, 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 and so on. And he find the brevity to be open, and he find the brevity.
The bravery, yeah.
Yes, bravery.
Humility, yeah.
To be decisive enough, let people do their work. Collect, analyze, and produce some ideas. It was very unusual at that time. In some sense, it's unusual even now.
It's hard.
It's hard, but it's proved to be effective.
So this elastic defense is easy to say in theory, but it's very hard to do in practice because for Ukrainians right now fighting on their land, trading territory even temporarily to allow for a counterattack that can expel the enemy from, if you look at what the Germans do, not trying to say we can copy that, but maybe the principles of mobile defense versus positional defense. It's a debate that's open today. With unmanned systems and drones, there's a very different environment, but there's an ability to potentially mass forces for counterattacks in different ways. And this is something I think is a debate that Ukrainian military internally should be having. Are we a positional defense doctrine, or are we elastic defense? And what are the implications of that for the front line and territory that is very hard to give up? Even 24 hours, you take it back. If the way the Germans did it, they massed a lot more forces for counterattacks. They created forces for counterattacks and reserves that were able to stop any breakthroughs by having temporary trading of territory for the ability to destroy the enemy on that ground. And this is a debate I think the Ukrainian military probably is having internally. We may not see it publicly, but it's a difficult question. In theory, it looks great, but on practice, it's very hard.
The elastic defense in German understanding in that time, and even in modern understanding, it's not an easy type of maneuver.
It's harder to do.
Yes, and this is not a question about your motherland or your territory or enemy territory. Even you try to conduct it in somewhere in desert,
yeah, it's
where
hard.
nobody live, it's hard.
Yeah,
And Germans, they understand it better than somebody else.
yeah,
And they remember they take a time, they organize the training center, they organize the study of new doctrine for officers of all ranks, because it's a key of success. If leader will not understand the doctrine, you should not expect any effective actions from the soldiers.
yeah,
Yes, they understand that it's not enough to create a doctrine. The most important to apply the doctrine.
yeah,
And it's verifiable to apply effective.
yeah,
In sense of do not make the doctrine wrong,
yeah,
just because an ineffective employment.
yeah,
They understand it clear, and they put a lot of effort in sense of to be successful, in sense of training, study, and so on and so on. As for philosophic question, whether or not you should trade the territory, yes, it is a painful question for any conflict and any war. I try to think as a military professional. For sure, the pure combat visibility should be a #1 factor. Because if you try to catch and build defense for any wood area, any hate in any village. You can very easily go the situation as the French army had more than 100 years ago. If you will continue, take a look back and think, okay, what is the mass media will say about this village, why I lost this village, blah, blah, blah. I understand this is painful, this is uncomfortable, and this should make me angry, but it should not stop me from making the effective military decision. And again, we need to go to military culture. It is a part of military culture, and it's impossible to create just in one moment.
And if you're debating the wisdom of practicing and training for and implementing elastic defense versus positional, elastic defense is harder. It's a higher level of warfare. It takes a lot more training, because the heart of an elastic defense is you're going to have less forces on the line of contact. You're going to have more potentially reconnaissance out, more outposts, maybe unmanned systems, and you're going to save your forces, your highest skilled forces, which now might be your people itself versus unmanned systems maybe forward. But those forces are going to be held back, but they have to be much better trained. They have to be effective at counterattacking, because if you lose that forward line, but then you're immediately able to destroy the enemy force and counterattack, then you've actually destroyed more enemy, lost less of your own forces, and still held the territory. And the Germans made that conscious decision. We're going to go through the pain of training, and training and reforming an army in peacetime is difficult. In wartime, it's even more difficult. And a lot of people say, well, we'll do that after the war. But you got to win the war first, and to win the war, you have to be able to do the hard things, which is reforming under fire. And I think this case study is a perfect example of it's been done before. And if there's a debate in the Ukrainian military about which way to go, the other benefit to the elastic defense was, what's the benefit of learning how to counterattack in the defense? It led to the next part of the innovation, which was creating new offensive doctrine.
It's very common meaning, very common opinion, when the people build the direct communication between the effective German elastic defense and effective German offensive doctrine. But again, if you take a look on some specific details, the Germans create the offensive doctrine on a basis of French people will try to build defense on the elastic principle. And actually, initially, they did not.
Yeah.
So I touch this question because from time to time, people understand that their image of situation is only one which is correct.
Yeah.
But in fact, in real life, it was not always. It's just from time to time. And again, as soon as the French people, actually French and Brits, try to replicate something like elastic defense, they were successful. And they stopped the German advance.
Yeah.
In this case, we got like, actually they got, like a tactical stalemate, but on a new level.
Yeah.
And I believe 1 year, maybe a few months, and German potentially they could find a new solution. It's like a non-stop process.
Yeah.
Back to the sources and back to the mythology. We are going to talk about the mythology, how to create it. Remember the Germans, you described this episode when the Germans, after described this episode, when the German captured the French manual how to build defense.
Yes. And the French never used it.
Yes, French never use it, but they study it carefully.
Yeah.
Because it's again this example, they understand if the manual exists, somebody follow the manual.
That's what the Germans thought.
Yes, what the German thought, and yes, and their offensive tactics and their offensive way how to operate had a basis on this manual.
Yes.
Include this manual. And again, it's one of the examples when in the war, the image of the war and reality of the war, it's from time to time completely different pictures.
Yeah.
But as a source of new doctrine, the analyzing and understanding of enemies' points of view, quite important, quite important. It's why so many attention usually armies keep to the how to study the captured documents, how to study the new thoughts, and how to study the topics of discussions. I mean, in open in open space discussions.
Yeah.
What to do, what we should do, and so on and so on. And again, it makes the situation close to the modern situation in Ukraine. A lot of talking now about the drones, new tactics, new possible solutions, including technological solutions and possible tactical solutions. And I believe in Moscow, they watch it very carefully. First of all, because they have the same situation.
Yeah.
And, from time to time, you can find something more effective in your enemy. And for sure, they are quite interested about what is the main ideas now circulate in Ukrainian and European military society.
And the German army figured out one of the ways they, and 1918 is a very interesting year because the Soviet Union, which had just come into existence, basically almost surrendered. Ukraine became independent as part of that under the protection of German, and then became an occupation of German and Austrian forces. And that freed up a bunch of forces to go to the Western Front under Ludendorff, who said, okay, we have this one last chance to roll the dice, the iron dice of war, and create a breakthrough before the Americans come over here in mass. And this was the first time in 4 years the front basically moved at an operationally significant level. German military created some quite substantial breakthroughs, but they were never able to turn them into that big. There were some minor operational breakthroughs that the front really started to move. But what the Germans figured out was, and this is when tanks had come in, tanks had already been brought onto the battlefield. The Germans had faced tanks, they knew about tanks, but they didn't have the industrial capacity, or they didn't make the decision to make tanks for whatever reason. Tanks did not ever see any wide-scale adoption on the German side, the British side, and the American side. It was different. But what the Germans figured out in the, and this is building on their defensive counterattacking doctrine, was they figured out, well, we've been sitting in the same position for 4 years, but now we're learning how to counterattack, so we're starting to learn how to run again. And they're building these muscles of how do you assault and do fire and maneuver again, which is part of the defense. So that gave them this ability to exercise their offensive muscles. And then they captured this French document, studied it. The French never studied this document, but the Germans did. And they said, let's go try this new style of fighting, infiltration tactics. And what the Germans really did was a combined arms task organization, reorganization of their military. So the brigades and regiments that they were fighting with were completely reorganized to include combat engineers at the lowest level, to decentralize, and this is where you talk about the culture. It wasn't because the Germans had this long tradition of being very empowering of people in society. That was actually the opposite of German culture and tradition. But they just figured out this works. I mean, we have lots of civilians now joining the military, reserve officers. They've got business experience. They don't know, they've not been in the Army for 30 years. Most of those career officers, the junior ones, were killed. Okay, well, what do they say works? And they developed this concept, hey, leave us alone, give us the big mission, give us all the units we need pushed down to our level to do our job, and let us go, right? And the other big decision was, instead of trying to destroy every position, we're gonna push into an operational breakthrough, try to destroy command and control, artillery and bypass positions and keep moving and destroy those key nodes so that follow-on forces could create breakthroughs that were tactically significant and become operational. And tell me about your impressions of that period and those innovations, and what happened and what could have happened, I guess.
We need to go back the World War I origin, or actually World War I nature. Remember, it was a really great war. By the way, the other name of World War I is the Great War.
Yeah.
And still, even now, even after World War II. Why it was a great war? First of all, it was the first war with a long thousands kilometers of front line. Continuous front line. It's unbelievable, and it was quite unusual in that time. It's a war, the first war in the 20th century, with a new level of military technologies. Aviation, tanks, chemical weapons, radio, and a lot of different things. And again, it was a splash of expectation and reality, because after the offensive in 1914, after the 1916, on the Western Front, we had just a static defense, essentially static defense, with very small tactical offensive actions with a limited objective. And during these 2 years of trench warfare, you know, people became able to create the unbelievable things. You can improve your mortar fire. You can improve or create the new ways how to conduct the artillery barrage. You create and make more effective your chemical weapon. You create and make more effective your means of chemical defense. You put a lot of, by the way, about the industrial base and economical abilities. In comparison with tanks, Germans in that time already put a lot of effort, a lot of money and resources in aviation. And create probably the most effective aviation, military aviation in that time in the world.
That's where old
bombers, fighters, zeppelins.
And they continued that innovation in the interwar period.
Yes, they continued this innovation, but the start was during the World War I. Because, you know, remember, before World War I, the aviation, okay, it's like auxiliary role, nothing else. But now aviation start to play, have become the real main player on the battlefield. Again, in comparison with the tanks. And this is another example. When the military leadership recognized the potential of new technology and new weapon as aviation, as Germans did with aviation, and let it go, let it develop, you can reach unexpected results. Yes, and by the way, it's proved by World War I, interwar period, and World War II. And continue to keep some ideas during the even post-World War II period. I mean, theoretically. And with tank, the situation a little bit different. The firstly German, remember, they were so impressed at the Somme battle. With, by the way, the British tanks was not too much effective. Maybe psychologically, but not real tactically. And they say, okay, this is hard, this is new. We will not spend the resources, time, and pay attention to this new weapon, essential. And how much the point of view was changed during the post-war analysis and during the interwar period. The country who reject any tank innovations, in fact, during the World War I, became the motherland of new style of mechanized warfare, and demonstrate for the world, we can do it.
Even though their tanks demonstrably, technologically, were inferior to the French and British quality, it was the employment. Because the German army didn't start to build the really good tanks like the Tiger, the Panther and the Tiger until later in the war. But what made them successful in 1940 was this new technology laid on top of the innovation and doctrine and mission command and leadership and combined arms. Combining everything into one small tactical unit and then empowering that commander to make decisions within a broad framework.
And remember the unbelievable jump ahead in technologies if you're talking about the tanks.
Yeah.
In 1945, the combat vehicle, which considered as a tank in 1940, was
That
not
was
a
a
tank. Was not a tank
reconnaissance
at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the same situation with aviation and with the Navy.
Yeah, you have jets and rockets by the end of World War II. And we see the same thing happening now in the evolution of unmanned systems in Ukraine is the difference between the technology in just a few years.
I think the evolution, the vision of the modern weapon system in Ukraine, first of all, it is a part of a common world-scale evolution of such vision.
Yeah.
20 years ago, drone was something unique on the battlefield.
Yeah. I remember.
Remember United States Army, yes, a couple drones, maybe 10 drones under the division commander.
Yeah, it was like
Not less than
you had to
division
call
commander.
God to get a drone
Yeah.
in the American Army.
It was impressive.
Yeah.
It was interesting, but it was a very few example and very few pieces introduced during the all army forces.
Yeah.
Now the drone it is a weapon of platoon leader or
Yeah.
maybe squad leader.
Yeah. That's a primary
And
weapon.
this is only beginning, believe me.
Yeah.
We will very surprised past couple years when the drones start to fight without people at all.
Yes.
Now we are quite close to this line, but very soon we will cross.
So, depending on how long this current stage of fighting goes on, I believe that this is why we're doing this paper, and if people in the armed forces find this useful, we're happy to do more of these kind of case studies to use history as a practical tool to help Ukrainian armed forces learn how to fight and win on the battlefield. It is our strong belief, I think we hold collectively, that the army that reforms itself from the bottom up and listens to the lower warfighters, collects that information, makes the hard effort of reforming and training close to the front lines as possible their forces, and then figures out how to mass unmanned systems controlled by operators or even with autonomy or both at the tactical and operational level, who can figure out how to sequence and mass that is going to create the next major breakthrough in this war, if it continues for a while. And if it doesn't, whoever figures that out in an interwar period, the next war may be 6 weeks on one side or the other, because
if not 6 hours,
it could be very quick, because the first army to figure out, and this is the painful part about a peace that isn't perfect, where you don't feel like you've won, and I don't think Ukraine will feel, if we stop fighting now, that this is a true complete victory by any stretch. The painful part of it is that feeling that we didn't win, and we're very vulnerable going forward. But the gift in that to military is what the German army did after World War I. We didn't win, and we're going to study like crazy how to apply this new doctrine, so the next time it happens, God forbid it doesn't, but if it does, it's going to be different. And we're going to never, the worst thing for a military usually is a victory in terms of innovation. I mean, we've seen that time and again throughout history. Victory is not good for innovating and getting ready for the next war. And there's this famous book in American military history called First Battles. And it talks about how the American army is really, really good at losing the first battle of every war, because we're protected by 2 oceans, and we typically don't innovate or start innovating or learning until we get into a war, because we don't really need to. Mexico and Canada has never been, despite current conversations, that big of a threat. And that strategic depth that America has makes it lazy a lot of times. And I think because of the post-Cold War period, we've been a little bit better, but still we're very good at not doing well at the beginning of a war. And then how we finish that war really depends on how quickly we learn. as an army. And this is one of the things, I think the American Army has a lot of good case studies that you've studied at Command and General Staff College, the learning in the Pacific campaign, Korean War, Vietnam War. History shows that when an army does not reform in war on time, it will have a bad outcome. When it reforms quickly, it will have that's usually the army that will end up doing better or winning. And Ukraine has to, I think, take this military history tradition, that's our goal, and start doing it now. We can't wait until after the war to set up the world's top military history institute. We want to do it now. The Ukraine Military History Institute that will bring Western military tradition and study of it to Ukraine, because Ukraine has its own very rich tradition and heritage from all the way back in Kievan Rus, Cossack times, and its tradition as part of the Russian Empire. It learned different lessons, right? Fighting on different sides. But now that it's firmly part of the West and the European family, it can take the best of both and hopefully create a unique fusion of the two and be successful. Well, General Zabrodskyi, give me your final thoughts on this as an active Ukrainian Army general and military professional. What are your thoughts on how military history?
Firstly, I want to continue your point about from time to time armies do not have any choice. Or you will transform or change something, or you will die. And together with you will die your country.
Mm-hmm.
It's why from time to time the senior military leadership in any country should make a hard decision. Okay, or we are going to change something during the war in process, or we need to make that decision, but our country will not survive. And back to your point, secondly, about the worst case for military transformation is a victory. In some certain sense, yes. It sounds very controversial, but you know, as soon as the people became victorious, they tried to keep the model and the ways how to conduct warfare, as they did during this war, and usually stop to think about the next war. If we are talking about the World War II, for instance, and Korean War, it's more or less close historical period, but it's already two other wars.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to Vietnam War, it's completely different war, and so on and so on. But some people, they still keep the understanding how to operate in battlefield, how to conduct the operations, just because it was effective in that time. But it's not a guarantee it will be effective in the future. It's why the military research, military discussion, and open discussion, it's very important. And the German's history demonstrates us the interwar period, the reborn the army, reborn the state, with not good goals, but anyway, they did it.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to pay attention for such examples. Usually, history never repeat, but two things in this world repeat definitely. It is a situation and mistakes. Situation quite often out of our influence.
Yeah.
Let's do not repeat the mistakes, at least.
Well, it's a great place to end it. General Zabrodskyi, on behalf of the Ukraine Military History Institute, or Ukraine Military History Podcast, it was a pleasure speaking to you today. I hope to have many more conversations. And I'd like to encourage anyone who found this useful in the Ukrainian military, please send us your comments if you want us to do more of these. We're also opening up our website if people have case studies or points that you think will be helpful to the rest of the Ukrainian military. Please feel free to send it to us, and we could work with you to try and publish that and start a conversation about how to use this historical case study and other case studies and inform the current situation to come up with the best possible victory we can get for this war, but without becoming complacent, and prepare for whatever comes next. Thank you very much. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. I promised you at the beginning that I'd tell you more about our sponsors if you'd like to find a way to support the Ukraine Military History Podcast, the Borderlands Foundation more broadly, or if you'd like to work with myself and the contributors, the editors, and the guests that come on this show. So this podcast is produced by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation has two main initiatives. Our mission at the Borderlands Foundation, it was founded right after the war started in 2022, is to make sure that Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And there's two things that I'm passionate about helping Ukraine do. Number one is build a strong future for Ukraine, for my family that I'm raising here in Ukraine, through national military history study and education. I believe that nations, great nations, are founded and sustained and grow in strength based on the stories that those nations believe together about their history. And Ukraine has had a very complicated history. It's a very old country. A lot of people don't understand that Ukraine's 500 years older than actually Russia, as Ukraine was around before Russia. Ukraine was founded by Vikings that moved to this part of the world in the 8th and 9th century and were traders and became rulers of the local Slavic people. So Ukraine, Kievan Rus, was an ancient and the most powerful empire in Europe. And Ukraine's history is very controversial. Through the years, Russia has appropriated it, stolen it, called it their own, and then tried to change Ukrainian history to make it their own, this great rich heritage that Ukraine has. So our mission at the Ukraine Military History Institute is go back through history and reclaim Ukraine's great military history tradition, because Ukraine's military history tradition encompasses almost all the great military traditions in the world. It started out interfacing and competing with the Vikings as well as Constantinople, absorbed those traditions over the years. It became part of the Russian military history tradition, the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the Ottoman, Mongol, kind of Crimean Tatar heritage of Genghis Khan's great military tradition, all fused, competed, and created this unique military history tradition inside Ukraine, which I call the Ukrainian Cossack military history tradition, which takes from Western military history, the German, English, American Mission Command, NATO Mission Command School, as well as the good things, hopefully, and leaves the bad from the Russian school, deep battle, and a lot of the positive things that have come out of the Russian military history tradition. And our mission is to help with the world's best military history center studying the current war, going all the way back into history throughout Ukraine's history, starting battles from World War II that were fought in Ukraine, World War I, the first Ukrainian independence period from 1917 through the Russian Civil War in 1921, back to the Cossack period, all the way back. Ukraine has a great and unique style of fighting and tradition of fighting. The first written constitution was written by a Ukrainian Cossack class. The warrior class wrote down the first Declaration of Rights in history, in modern history, which founded the Enlightenment, led to the American Declaration of Bill of Rights, the Polish Constitution, and a number of other declarations of rights and constitutions since then were all inspired first by Ukraine's Declaration of the Rights with Pep Orlok after the defeat at Poltava at the hands of Peter the Great. So understanding Ukraine's military history tradition is a passion of ours. And every author who comes on this episode, who publishes a written work, we're actually paying those authors. So if you want to donate to support the authors, you can donate to get access to anything that's been published in the Ukraine Military History membership site, which we're going to be releasing soon, where people who write about the current war or things from the past in Ukrainian military history, or some military historical case study that can help Ukraine think about how to fight and win and innovate in the current war, all those authors are getting paid by the center. I want to encourage great scholarship by paying Ukrainians to write their own history, and other people want to contribute to pay them to build this body of work and knowledge at the Ukraine Military History Institute. So when you donate to support this podcast, we have production costs. It helps us pay the author that we come on and interview about what they've written or what they've done, and then also just pays for all the production costs, the social media, the distribution, and everything that you enjoy about this podcast. So that's the first way you can support the center. The second big way you can support the center is we have and are building a Heroes of Ukraine tour, which is going to be a custom program that we're developing, which takes people who want to come in and see the battlefields of Ukraine from the current war that have been liberated. We can take you to different battlefield sites. The Battle of Kiev, which we've studied very well and have a lot of material, people who've studied that and can show that to you. Or if you want to go out to other sites, battles that have in territory that's been liberated in Kherson or Zaporizhia or other places out in Sumy or Kharkiv province, we can take you around to those sites. This is something we're developing. We want to launch this if and when the full-scale fighting with Russia pauses. We believe this could be a much bigger tour that people can come on a tour just buying individual seats and over a couple of weeks meet people from all over the world who want to see Ukraine. But before we do that public version of the tour where anyone can book any number of seats at scheduled times, if any of you would like to have a tour of the battlefields of Ukraine that have already been liberated and are safe, we don't do war tourism to active parts of the fighting, but we do tours, historical staff ride battlefield tours for military professionals, government officials, and or business leaders that would like to understand what has happened here. You can contact us about the Heroes of Ukraine tour. So that's the Ukraine Military History Institute, which pays for and produces this podcast. The next sponsor I'd like to discuss is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is a center that is near and dear to my heart because of my past service in combat as a soldier, my study of history and the history of psychological trauma that comes from serving in combat, personal experience of my own, overcoming my own struggles with it, is a center dedicated to helping advance the research conversation and funding of breakthrough technologies and treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects a number of soldiers who've served in Ukraine. And we want to make sure that they recover psychologically to become productive, vibrant leaders in the future of Ukraine. This is headed by Major General Vladislav Klitschko, retired, the former commander, the first commander of the Moral Psychological Support Forces of Ukraine under the Commander-in-Chief, President Valery Zaluzhny. It was a new position that he created right before the full-scale invasion. And General Klitschko has written his PhD on military psychology of a soldier and is passionate about advancing the study and the treatment of this disorder for Ukrainian veterans. This is a podcast that we're going to be releasing very soon in Ukrainian, translated into English for those who are not Ukrainian that want to listen in on the conversation and comment on it on our social media. But the interviews will be conducted in Ukrainian to advance and start the conversation for Ukrainian veterans, mental health professionals, and government officials who are working on this problem, which we believe is critical to solve for the future of Ukraine. So if you'd like to donate to support that podcast, to help us produce and start that conversation, or if you'd like to inquire about donating to supporting specific veterans going through different treatments, workshops for treatment of PTSD, you're welcome to reach out to us. The center also has a rehabilitation through golf program where we pay for Ukrainian veterans to play golf and go play in our annual Heroes of Ukraine Freedom Summit Golf Tournament, which will be held next year in Dallas in the United States in March. And this is a very important program that you can also take a look at sponsoring veterans in their journey to mental health recovering. So that's the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. And then finally, for those of you who watch this podcast, that you see our co-hosts, some of the guests that come on there, all of our podcasts are filmed in Ukraine. The reason we do this is I believe in talking to Ukrainians and people who will actually come to Ukraine that want to speak about Ukrainian military history, analysis of the current war, defense industry issues, all the things that we need to learn in Ukraine and our allies and NATO who've supported Ukraine to fight and win the next war against our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran. All of the people that support Vladimir Putin are learning from this war the lessons that Russia's learning. We need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the war that Ukrainians are learning better and implement those across the force for our partner forces, Americans, British, all the other European NATO forces, partners out east, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all the countries that are supporting Ukraine. We want to make sure that we create a community that disseminates those lessons. And we get contacted by different groups, sometimes governments, foreign militaries that would like advisory services to help them learn and implement the lessons of this war for their armed forces. Defense companies would reach out and would like to get help developing, testing their product, selling their product inside Ukraine that may be helpful on the battlefield. That's what the Borderlands Group does. We advise defense tech companies. We even do forward support engineering for defense tech companies, software development, hardware, hiring and staffing, forward deployed engineering shop for Western defense companies. So all those services, if you're looking for advisory services, custom analytical studies by Rob Lee and his team, defense advisory services for defense companies or foreign militaries, we can put together a package for you, give you a proposal, and help you with that. So to get in touch with us, just go to the website for theborderlandsgroup.com, fill out our contact us form. We'll evaluate your request and get back to you in the appropriate secure communication channel if that's what you'd like to do. So thank you for watching the sponsor reads here. It's important to me that we provide value to you in every podcast episode, and these are the ways that you can support us so we can continue to afford to produce and expand and increase the frequency of our content production for the benefit of Ukraine and its allies fighting this war, winning this war, and the next.